All right. We've been talking about the last couple of weeks about what was going on in Asia and the Western Hemisphere. Now we're going to go back geographically back to the West, back to Europe, and talk about what happened in Europe and in the Mediterranean world following the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire, remember, the traditional date is 476 AD. That's when the Roman Empire in the West fell apart, ceased to exist. But on the ruins of what had been the Roman Empire, there did emerge new empires and new cultures that in one way or another were very much influenced and shaped by the legacy of ancient Rome. And one such state in particular is the Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium, the Byzantine civilization, or Byzantium, which grew out of what had formerly been the eastern part, the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. But that wasn't the only state or empire or culture that developed on the ruins of the Roman Empire. Another one, believe it or not, was Islam. Now, most of you, when you read the news or follow the news any day, when you hear Islam, you don't, in your mind, link it with the West. You don't link it with European history. But the fact of the matter is that Islam very much is a product of Western civilization. It very much is something that came out of the ruins of the Roman Empire. And there's a great deal of influence that Rome had on Islam. In fact, and it had a lot to do with the fact that Arabs were a part of the Roman Empire. In fact, there was even an Arab emperor. Did you know that? Philip the Arab, the 3rd century emperor, was an Arab from what is today would be Jordan. So Arabs had always been a part of the Roman Empire, had fought in Roman armies. Many Arab tribes had converted to Christianity before the coming of Islam. So Islam, believe it or not, is another part of the legacy of ancient Rome. And in some ways more than Byzantium. Now, another part of the world that was influenced of Rome was what had formerly been the western parts of the Roman Empire, what is today France and Spain and parts of Germany. And this area would come to be dominated by a German tribe that would very much be influenced by Roman culture and tradition. That would be the Franks, the Germanic tribe that gave their name to France. So the Franks and the empire of Charlemagne was yet another legacy of what was ancient Rome. All right, so today we're going to be focusing on the first of these three, the Byzantine Empire, and probably, if we have time, we'll start to talk about Islam as well. All right, so let's talk about Byzantium. Now, the reason why this civilization is called Byzantine or Byzantium civilization is because for the whole history of this civilization, the focal point of this civilization, the center of this civilization, was the city of Constantinople, the great city that Constantine had founded. And Constantinople was founded upon the ruins of a Greek city called Byzantium. And so that's where you get the name. Now, it has another reason for it is because this civilization that we're going to discuss, the civilization of Byzantium, was very much a Greek-speaking civilization. Greek became the language of the government and of law, and very much the legacy of ancient Greek civilization very much influenced and shaped Byzantine civilization. So, because of the Greek influence and the importance of Constantinople, the former site of the Greek city of Byzantium, that's why they refer to this civilization as Byzantine civilization, to distinguish it from ancient Rome, because this was a civilization that literally developed directly out of what had been the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the part of the Roman Empire that did not fall when the western part of the empire fell victim to barbarian invasions.
So,
all right, yeah, yes?
I'm sorry, would this be what is referred to as the Hellenists during biblical times?
The Hellenists?
Yeah, they referred to the Greeks.
Oh well, this is that would have been those would have been in the terms of the Bible, that would have been centuries earlier during the Hellenistic period.
But it would have been at the time of the original Byzantium as well.
Oh yeah, Byzantium was a flourishing city up until it was actually destroyed during the 3rd century civil wars. It was destroyed actually in like about 195 or so AD. It was burned and destroyed by Septimius Severus. So basically, when Constantine came to the scene, the city was kind of a ruin, a vestige of itself, and he rebuilt it, totally restructured it, and renamed it Constantinople after himself. All right, so now the thing about the Byzantine Empire, why did the empire in the East survive, whereas the empire in the West collapsed? Now, a part of it was just geography. Oops. Let me show you a map here. No, this isn't a very good map. But anyway, if you look at this map here, here's Constantinople right here. And the thing about a Byzantine Empire was that it did not have the exposed border that the West had. You know, the Western Empire, the Rhine River really did not pose a real boundary for the Western Roman Empire. But you see, the Eastern Roman Empire had Constantinople. So if barbarian tribes crossed the Rhine River, let's say they crossed the Rhine River and invaded the Balkans, they could only get about right here. They didn't have a navy to speak of. The Eastern Roman Empire did have a navy. And plus they had the great city of Constantinople that was walled. The great walls were built by Theodosius. It was a great city. And barbarian tribes could just not get past it. There were many times when Constantinople would be besieged by barbarian peoples, and it always was able to sustain such a siege because of its very strategic location. It's walled and it's built on a peninsula. It's very, as long as they had a navy, they could defend it. Now, on the eastern border, you have the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire was a settled, civilized state, and as a result, the Eastern Roman Empire could always negotiate with them. You can't negotiate with a bunch of barbarian tribes, coming across the border, burning and looting, led by their own personal commanders. You can't negotiate with such a huge mass of different groups of people. But with the Persians, since they were civilized and had an empire and had a diplomatic corps, they could buy them off with gold, they could negotiate with them, and so this border here was much more secure. So just by the accident of geography, this really was something that gave the Eastern Roman Empire the ability to survive when the Western Empire did not. Now, another factor in the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire was that it had a lot more cities and towns than the West did, and therefore it had a lot of trade and a strong economy. And that gave the Eastern Roman Empire, all these cities gave the Eastern Roman Empire the revenue, from taxes to continue to raise armies and support themselves. Whereas in the West, where you didn't have that settled cities like to the same degree, that was not an option. So the Eastern Roman Empire was able to survive, whereas the Western did not. Now, another factor for this success was the fact that the Eastern Roman Empire had a series of very excellent emperors. And these are all emperors who had risen up the ranks of the army. They weren't born into wealth necessarily, but they had signed up for the army, fought and been successful in their army career, and as a result had risen up to the top ranks of the military and put themselves in a position to become an emperor when the last emperor died. One of the more important of these emperors was the Emperor Leo. You see his dates here, 457 to 474 AD. He would have been the emperor when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. One of the decisions that Leo made that was very important in history was that he decided that he was no longer, the empire could not afford to hire these mercenaries, these Germanic barbarians, to fight in their armies because they were untrustworthy and they only fought out of plunder and for gold, and they weren't necessarily trusted. They were good soldiers, but not necessarily trustworthy. And what Leo did was that he focused on recruiting within the empire. Now, in what is today eastern Turkey, there were a people called the Isaurians. Now, many people think, some historians think the Isaurians are the ancestors of the modern-day Kurds. Maybe if you listen to the news, the Kurds are people who live in Iran and Syria and Turkey today. But some people think the Isaurians were the ancestors of the Kurds. Well, the Isaurians lived in the mountains of eastern Turkey, and they were very hardy and strong and healthy people living in their villages, and they'd been part of the Roman Empire for centuries. And what Leo said is, I'm going to recruit these mountain people, and I'm going to use them as my army, and not rely on a bunch of outside barbarians. So the Isaurians were recruited, and the Isaurians served as loyal soldiers in the Byzantine Empire, and that gave them an advantage because the Isaurians were part of the empire. They were more loyal and more trustworthy because they were a part of the empire rather than recruited from outside beyond the borders of the empire. Now, another reason for the success of the empire, let's just say the survival, I don't know if they were that successful, was that they avoided, the emperors like Leo and his successors, these early emperors, they avoided religious conflict. Now, they were Christian. The Roman Empire had been officially Christian since Theodosius, since 395 AD. All the pagan temples have been closed. But the emperors in the East, for the most part, decided not to push it. So we know from archaeological remains that pagan religion survived, and there was no effort to try to crush them or to imprison them or to shut them down. Pagan philosophers still taught their classes in Athens. There's no effort to stop them or stifle them. And also, when there were divisions within the church, these emperors decided to not let it be a problem, to just allow divisions to occur. Now, there had been a huge division in the church that happened as a result of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. You see, in the middle of the 5th century, there was a huge division in the church about the nature of Christ. This was always, who was Jesus? That's just something people were always asking themselves. That's why they had the Council of Nicaea. That was the first ecumenical council back in 323 AD. Now, this was the 4th ecumenical council they held at Chalcedon in 451, and the question was, did Jesus have a human soul? Did he have a fully human soul? Everybody agreed that he was the Son of God, that he was divine. He was a part of the Trinity. But did he have a human soul? Now, the Monophysites, they believed that Jesus only had divine, he was only divine. He was a man, physically a man, yes, but he only had one nature. Monophysite means one nature. His one nature was divine. And the Monophysite churches were very strong in Egypt and Syria, and they had really grown. Now, at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, that position was rejected by the bishops, the leaders of the church that met at Chalcedon. And they took the position, and this is still the position of Protestants and mainstream Protestants and Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox today. They took the position that's called duophysite, that Jesus had two natures, that he had a fully human soul, but he was also God. So he was God and a man, and he had a fully human soul. So he had two natures, a human soul, and the two together, his human soul and his divine nature and his human nature were so blended together to make one person. You couldn't distinguish one from the other. That Jesus was just fully blended in a mysterious way, both man, human soul, and a divine soul. Now, when this decision was made, what happened was that the Monophysite churches, they went their way, and the Orthodox, the Duophysite churches, they went their way. Now, what happened in the course of time was that this division took an ethnic course, in the sense that in Egypt, for example, native Egyptian speakers, they adopted the Monophysite churches en masse. But the Orthodox position remained popular in the big cities like Alexandria. The same was true in Syria. Now, the emperors at this time, they decided that they weren't going to touch this issue because they knew it was a divisive issue. So the emperors, like Leo and his successors, they would just simply say, well, we're Christian and we're not going to worry about it. If you want to be Monophysite, whatever. If you want to be Orthodox, whatever. That's your call. We're not going to touch it. And that's how it stood for a good number of years. Now, a major change occurred in, and by the way, the Monophysite Church still survives. In Ethiopia and in Egypt, the churches there are, the Coptic Church of Egypt is a Monophysite church. Question?
How much did you say that Monophysite created the Orthodox Christian Church?
No. The Monophysites were a separate church from the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox position was duophysite, two natures rather than one nature.
All the Rome fell, all the allied peoples and tribes that were originally loyal to Rome, did they basically become loyal to Byzantine, or did?
Well, you see, since the Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire in the East, that loyalty remained. Yeah, okay. It was then when the West collapsed that they went their separate ways, but the East remained secure. Now, now a big change occurred in the history of the Byzantine Empire with the Emperor Justinian. And you can see the dates there, had a very long reign. Now, Justinian, what happened was that his uncle, Justin, had been one of these guys who had risen up the ranks of the military, and Justin had no son of his own, so he had adopted Justinian as his son and heir. And so Justinian had no background as a general. You know, he had been born into wealth. He had been educated by his uncle. So he assumed the throne in 527 AD, thanks to his uncle, Justin. Now, Justinian, though, was still, he was a Latin speaker. His family came from what today would be Albania, in Illyria, it was called in those days. And his native language was Latin. And he had a vision of trying to restore the Roman Empire. He wanted to reconquer the West. He wanted to reconquer Italy and Gaul and Spain and North Africa. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its full extent. And he was very, very insistent upon that. He was a man of great ambition. So that was one of the things he wanted to do. He wanted to restore the empire. Another thing he wanted to do was that he wanted to establish one law to govern all of Rome. He wanted to codify all of Roman law, and that was one of his goals. His third goal, and this was very, very ambitious, he wanted to end the differences within the church. He wanted to bring Monophysites and Duophysites together and end the division, and his vision was one empire, one law, one church. And he kind of viewed himself as the heir of Solomon. You know, he saw himself as head of the church and head of state, all rolled into one. Viewed himself as an equal of the apostles. That was one of the titles he assumed. I am the equal of the apostles. So he kind of assumed this kind of aura about him, this holy, sanctimonious order around him. You see there's a mosaic of Justinian with his courtiers, a very famous mosaic from Ravenna in northern Italy. Now, so of all these goals, he only succeeded in one of them. The other ones didn't go too well. And in the process, he destroyed the empire, almost brought it to its knees. So he was very ambitious, and but he was a failure in a lot of ways. For example, now the one area where he succeeded was in law. He did bring together a bunch of esteemed jurists, and he codified all of Roman law. It's called the Justinian Code. So all the laws of Rome going back centuries were all brought together and codified into a single document. And it was written in Latin, which was still the official language of the empire at this time, even though it was a dying language. And he also, this Justinian Code was important because it would become the way that Roman law would be would transform society. You know, when in France and Great Britain, everywhere where the Roman Empire had been, every area that was impacted by the Roman Empire, they were influenced by Justinian Code. And the Justinian Code has influenced English common law, it's influenced American law, it's influenced our Constitution, it's influenced every country, every part of the world that's ever been influenced by European civilization, the Justinian Code. So even though he didn't play much of a role in doing the actual work, by the very fact that he ordered this great work to be done. And all these jurists that spent hours putting, or years of their lives putting this code together. That was his greatest achievement. So the Justinian Code is the capstone of Roman law. All the traditions and all the achievements of Roman law were all rolled into this great Justinian Code that has shaped and influenced laws and politics and government ever since. So that was a great achievement. Now his other goals didn't go too well. Now he tried to reconquer the West, and it didn't. Now he did go into North Africa. The Germanic tribe, the Vandals, had conquered North Africa, and he went in there and he cleared them out. So he was able to restore North Africa and to Roman rule. He also moved into Italy. Now in Italy he really had a problem. Now a Germanic tribe called the Ostrogoths had taken over Italy. And he went in there with his armies, and he waged war against the Ostrogoths, and it's called the Gothic Wars. And these wars, the irony of it is that these wars were more destructive of life and property than any previous barbarian invasion of Italy. The wars between Justinian's armies and the Ostrogoths, this war raged for several decades. And the Ostrogoths would not go down. They just kept on fighting. And it was this Rome, during the course of this war, the city of Rome was sacked like twice by different armies. Now Justinian was so desperate for troops that he started to go ahead and recruit barbarian Germanic tribes in his armies. And they were disaster. They didn't have any loyalty to Justinian. They only fought for gold and for plunder. So they were just as destructive. The armies of the empire were just as destructive of life and property as the Ostrogoth barbarian tribes, and sometimes more so. So these wars were devastating, and it was only at the very end of his reign, it was only close to 565 AD toward his death, that Italy was finally pacified, and the Ostrogoths were ultimately defeated. But the cost was that Italy, the whole peninsula, was devastated by years of war, and cities and towns had been destroyed. The city of Rome was just completely wiped out. I mean, it still existed, but it was just a shadow of itself. So the fact that he spent all his time and treasure in Italy, he never even got to Spain or Gaul. Those areas remained under different barbarian tribes. So he never was able to reconquer or reestablish the Roman Empire like he had planned. Now, another area where he sowed a lot of bad seeds was his effort to try to make one church. For example, he didn't have any stomach for pagans, so he ordered pagans to be killed if they did not convert to Christianity. And he shut down all pagan schools of philosophy in Athens because he thought that there should only be one church and one religion. There are all these little sects of churches that have been established all over the Byzantine Empire going back centuries, all these different, I guess we call them denominations of Christianity. He would order his troops to go in there and burn them, kill everybody in sight. Like, he would have his troops surround a church and burn everybody in there, kill them all. He said, I got to purify the empire of all these heretics. So he was ordering thousands of people to be killed. And he said he was determined to crush the Monophysites. He wanted the Orthodox position to be the only position. So in Egypt and in Syria, he ordered Monophysite churches to be closed. And anybody who opposed him, he ordered to be killed. And of course, this was not a good idea because these Monophysite churches, they were going to be loyal to their faith, and they refused to be bullied, and they just basically ignored his rule, considered him to be a false ruler, the Antichrist, an evil man, and they just refused to have anything to do with him. And by the end of his reign, there were parts of Egypt and Syria that were basically ignoring imperial officials, not paying their taxes, not having anything to do with the empire. And this would be a terrible thing because it wouldn't be soon after this that foreign armies would invade the empire, and these areas would show no loyalty to the empire at all. So by the time that Justinian died, you had a situation where you had internal dissent. Huge parts of the empire in Egypt and Syria were ignoring the government. You had a treasury that was empty. because all the gold that had been accumulated by previous rulers had been spent to fight these wars that had not gone anywhere. Also, another thing about Justinian was he spent a huge amount of money on palaces and churches. You know, he built a great church of holy wisdom, Hagia Sophia, in what is today Istanbul. You can still go see it. In Constantinople, he built this great, huge, beautiful church. And when he walked in, he said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." You know, like he was better than Solomon. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. He said, "I am superior to, I am great, built the greatest temple ever." He really had a big head. But anyway, the church was in ruins. The empire was busted, and soon after his death, what happened was that the empire was faced with a new wave of barbarian invasions in the end of the 6th, early 7th century.
Didn't he have a lot of peasant uprisings too because of the heavy taxes and stuff he was placed on?
Well, a lot of the uprisings, many people think that in Egypt and Syria, one reason why people might have been attracted to the Monophysite church was not so much religious reasons, but because it was seen as you could legitimize not paying taxes. Oh, he's against my religion, so I'm not going to pay taxes. You see, and so people are religious for some people choose a religion for spiritual reasons, other people choose it for other reasons, and some people see the Monophysite Orthodox division as a division between the city versus rural areas that were Egypt spoke native Egyptian, and cities that spoke Greek, so they see it as an ethnic conflict. All right, now, so the empire was really inundated with these new barbarians, like the Avars. Remember, we talked about the Avars. They were one of these barbarian tribes that invaded China back in the 3rd century A.D. Now, when you get to the 7th century A.D., the Avars had made their way all the way across the Eurasian steppes, and they had settled in Hungary, what is today Hungary, in the Danube Valley. And these Avars were threatening Constantinople itself. Along with the Avars, you had a people called the Slavs. Now, the Slavs are one of the great debates. Nobody knows who the Slavs were. Their homeland would be what is today Romania and Ukraine, the hills and mountains of the Carpathian Mountains that are on the border between Romania and the Ukraine. And so they were a people who, they think that was their homeland. But over the course of the 6th and 7th century, Slavs appear to have kind of migrated from their homeland into what is today Russia and into Poland and into great parts of much of Eastern Europe. In fact, most Eastern Europeans today speak some Slavic language. So Slavic peoples were on the move. And many times the Slavic tribes were conquered by the Avars. The Avars were a people that they had a horde mentality. So like with the Avars, if you signed up to fight for them, if you were a good warrior, you could join the horde. You could join the Avar horde. You could join the Avar army and go out and pillage and burn and loot and do what Avars do. So it wasn't an ethnic thing. It was like if you were a good warrior, hey, sign them up, join them up. Let's make the army bigger. So many Slavs Slavic tribes were in league with and subject to the Avars, but working with them to invade the Byzantine Empire. So you had Slavs, you had Avars. Another group of people were the Lombards. Now the Lombards were a Germanic people, and the Lombards is short for an English, sounds like English, Longobardi, long beards, because what marked these people was they all looked like ZZ Top. They all went into battle. They all had these big, thick, heavy beards, and they were called the Longbeards, and they were a Germanic people, and they came in from Germany, and they had settled in what is today Slovenia, but they crossed over the Alps and they occupied much of Italy, and they gave their name actually to northern Italy. To this day, northern Italy is called Lombardy, and in fact, there's a big difference if you look at northern Italians and southern Italians. There's a huge difference. In northern Italians, it's not uncommon to find blue eyes and blonde hair. They look like they're Germans. And whereas in the south of Italy, they look more Greek, and they have the olive skin and the dark eyes. And a lot of the differences have to do with the fact that at this particular time in history, hordes of Germans crossed over the Alps and settled in northern Italy and gave their name to the Lombard Plain, the Po Valley of northern Italy is called Lombard. So you have, and then that wasn't just it. So you had Lombards, you had Slavs, you had Avars, and then you had the Persians. The Persians were not a barbarian people, but they were on the move. They were trying to restore the Persian Empire of Darius, of Cyrus, and their armies occupied Egypt, and their armies occupied Syria. And the thing about it was that a lot of the Monophysite churches, the Persians weren't Christian. The Persians were Zoroastrians. And so a lot of the Monophysite churches would say, hey, we'll be loyal to the Persians as long as they allow us to have our churches. And so a lot of times the Persians, when they occupied these areas, they faced no resistance. A lot of the Monophysite people, the Monophysite Christians, embraced them as liberators because they were tired of being having to face persecution at the hands of the Byzantine Empire. Now, many people think that the Byzantine Empire might have just cracked at this point, but it didn't. The thing about the Byzantine Empire, it was kind of like, you hear about football defenses where they bend, they don't break. The Byzantine Empire was a bender, not a breaker. They could sustain a lot, but as long as they had Constantinople, they could use that as a base to kind of keep on the fight. Now, they found a hero in the form of the Emperor Heraclius. Now, Heraclius was his homeland was North Africa, but he became emperor, and he was able to rally the troops and overcome these barbarian tribes. He drove back the Avars. Well, in the process, he promised to give them a huge amount of tribute every year in gold. But he drove back the Avars, drove back the Slavs, and then he invaded the Persian Empire and captured their capital. One of the capitals of the Persian Empire was in what is today would be the area around Baghdad, Ctesiphon, and it was one of their area capitals. And he actually burned it to the ground and captured one of the key Persian cities. So Heraclius just knocked out the Persians and defeated them and saved the empire and restored the empire. Now, one of the sad things about Heraclius is that after he spent his entire life waging war and defending the empire and driving back this barbarian tribe and that barbarian tribe, by the way, he never recovered Italy. The Lombards remained in control of much of Italy, but nonetheless, he did save the empire. And then, toward the end of his life, when he was an old man, a new barbarian tribe, and this was the Arabs. So he had to deal with the first onslaught of the Arab, the now inspired by the religion of Islam to fight jihad. He had to fight against the Arabs, and he lost. So after waging all these wars, by the time he died in 641 AD, the empire was threatened yet again, and this time by the tremendous advance of Arab peoples inspired by the religion of Islam. Now, the Arabs had great success. By 635 AD, they had conquered most of Syria, the Palestine, and big chunks of Anatolia, what is today Turkey. And basically, the empire was on its heels. Now, by 717 AD, the empire had basically shrunk to Constantinople. All they had left was Constantinople. The Arab armies were on the move, and the city of Constantinople was under siege by an army of Arabs, by land and by sea. And it was at this point that they had a new guy come to the forefront, and his name was Leo III. He was an Isaurian. He was descended from those Isaurians that had saved the empire centuries earlier. So Leo the Isaurian, as he's called, he was able to rally the people. Now, he did a great thing. He got the people excited. He got the people behind it. You know how he did it? He ordered a bunch of monks. He took off his shirt and walked around the city and ordered a bunch of monks to whip him. He said, let me suffer for the sins of my people. And he was whipped all around. And he went all around the city. He carried a big cross. Now, who carried a big cross and was whipped? Jesus. And he walked around the city like this. They were whipping him. They're beating him. And said, I'm doing this for the sins of my people. And he did that. And all the people were like, we're going to fight for this guy. This guy will not lead us. And they fought back. And then they had a secret weapon. They had Greek fire. Nobody knows to this day what Greek fire was. They think it was like napalm. It was the Greeks would shoot it from hoses, and then when it caught fire, it would burn it. Water couldn't even put it out. And they would shoot. It was called Greek fire. They'd shoot it at the Arab fleet, and it destroyed the Arab fleet. The secret weapon. And so they destroyed the entire Arab fleet that was besieging the city with this Greek fire, and the Arabs had to withdraw. And so Leo III saved the city. And he founded the Isaurian dynasty. Now, by the time the Isaurian dynasty, there, you can see the dates there, 717 to 802 AD. By the time that Leo III started his reign, and during the time of the 8th century, the Byzantine Empire was a lot different. It was a lot smaller. It basically was Greece, Constantinople, and the western part of Anatolia. It was also much more homogeneous culturally. It was basically a Greek-speaking empire. In fact, by the 8th century, Latin was no longer the language of government. Greek was. Greek had replaced Latin. And most of the people who lived within the empire spoke Greek. So it would become basically a Greek-speaking empire. Another thing about this empire was that it was very rural. There weren't that many. Most of the towns and cities over the course of these wars had been ruined and destroyed. So the only real city left was the city of Constantinople itself. Now, beginning with Heraclius and continuing under the Isaurian emperors, they developed a very good system of national defense. And the way that the empire was organized was that it was organized into different provinces. Each province was called a theme. Think of like a theme, a music theme or whatever. But each theme was a province, and each province was accorded a certain number of soldiers. Now, with all these threats of invasion, the emperors figured out that the best way to keep the empire safe was to always have soldiers ready to fight at a moment's notice. To basically have a militia in place in every province that could be called up to fight when the empire was threatened. So there were all these soldiers, and within every theme you had a governor and you had soldiers, and these soldiers were given land on the condition that they fight for the empire. So you had these, they were basically like militia. They were farmers, they had their farms, but when called upon to fight, they were required to form a body to fight for the empire. And these soldiers were very good. Now, another thing about the Byzantine Empire was that a lot of these soldiers that were fighting, these farmer soldiers that were fighting, were from outside the empire. There were a lot of them had formerly been barbarians or people from outside the empire who were brought in and given land on the condition that they fight as soldiers, and they turned out to be very good and loyal soldiers. And the interesting thing is, in Anatolia, a number of them were Arabs. The interesting story is that a lot of Christian Arabs, when Islam was expanding, they refused to convert. So a lot of these Christianized Arabs were given land within the Byzantine Empire and were soldiers. And in fact, their exploits were legendary. They were considered to be some of the greatest warriors who fought for the Byzantine Empire, these Arab Christians. And in fact, in medieval Greek literature, there's all these heroic tales and poetry that tell the tales of these Arab Greek Christian warriors who fought for the Byzantine Empire against Islam. And so, anyway, kind of an interesting tale here. But they were Arabs, but they were brought into the empire and given land. A lot of Slavs were as well. Slavic peoples were brought into the empire and given land on the condition that they fight for the empire. So this militia turned out to be very successful in allowing the empire to have a national defense to defend itself from invaders. Now, what happened next, though, in the empire was that, fortunately for the empire, by the 8th and 9th and into the 10th centuries, Islam was kind of on the fire had kind of gone out of the belly. They weren't so much interested in jihad anymore. And so this created a situation where the empire was not as threatened as much. And so, in fact, the Byzantine Empire actually went on the offensive and expanded against the Arabs into and reconquered even parts of Syria and eastern Anatolia from Arab peoples, from Islamic empire. So beginning with the 9th century, for several centuries, the Byzantine Empire enjoyed a great deal of peace and prosperity, and it's often related to the Macedonian dynasty. Now, the Macedonian dynasty is called the Macedonian dynasty because its homeland was in what is today Macedonia, in the country of Macedonia, in the former Yugoslavia. But it's an interesting story. The Macedonian dynasty was actually in origin Armenian, and they were Armenians who were given land in exchange for the military service in what is today Macedonia. And the founder of this dynasty, Basil I, great story. He was 7 feet tall. He was this huge warrior, and the Emperor Michael III was a homosexual, and he really got the hots for Basil. He saw him one day from his palace and said, "I want that guy." And so he made him a big shot commander and gave him all these honors, and he became a big shot in the military. Well, how does he reward him? He kills the emperor and assumes the throne himself, and becomes Basil I, the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Now, one of Basil's descendants was Basil II. Now, Basil II's reign is considered to be the high point of the later Byzantine Empire. And Basil II, you can see his dates here, 976 to 1025. He's known to history as Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Bulgar Slayer comes from the Bulgars. Now, you see, by this time, the empire faced some new threats. That Islam had receded as a threat, but a new threat had arisen to the north. Now, by the time of Basil II, the two greatest enemies of the Byzantine Empire were the Bulgars and the Rus. Think of Bulgaria and Russia. Now, the Bulgars, interesting enough, were related to the Avars. They were originally a Turkish-speaking people, and they had crossed the Eurasian steppe and intermarried with a lot of Slavs and adopted a Slavic language. Bulgarian is a Slavic language, and so they had lost their native Turkish language and adopted Slavic as their language. But they had given their name to a group of people who spoke a Slavic language, the Bulgarians. So we get Bulgaria from Bulgars. Now, the Bulgarians had adopted Christianity, and they had established an empire in what is today Bulgaria and Serbia and that particular part in the Balkans. And they were a rival. They had emerged as a rival to the Byzantine Empire. Now, another group of people were the Rus. Now, the Rus were originally Swedish Vikings. They were Swedes. And the Rus had come in, these Vikings from Sweden had come in, and they had intermarried with Slavic peoples, and they had adopted a Slavic language as their own. And so that's where we get the word Russia from the Rus. So they were descended from Vikings from Sweden, but they had intermarried to a large extent with the Slavs and spoke a Slavic language. And the Rus also had built an empire in what is today the Russia and the Ukraine, and they threatened the Byzantine Empire. Well, Basil II was a good diplomat, and what he did was that you played one enemy against another. He made an alliance with the Prince of Kiev, the ruler of Russia, and arranged for his daughter to marry that prince to seal the alliance. And then the Rus and Byzantine together made war on the Bulgarians. And he defeated the Bulgarians and completely defeated them, crushed their armies. And the story is that he had captured 15,000 Bulgarians. And to show that he was a Christian, merciful monarch, he, instead of slaughtering the 15,000, he blinded them all. He just blinded them, gouged out their eyes, except for one guy. He kept one guy with one eye. And what he did is he said, "Go back to Bulgaria." And he lined them up in a line and said, "Follow the guy with one eye." So all the 14,999 guys who were blind had to follow the one Bulgarian who had one eye all the way back to Bulgaria.
That was merciful.
He was very merciful because he just disfigured them instead of slaughtering them all. What a nice guy. But he was still known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer because he crushed the Bulgarian Empire and made it and made it subject to the Byzantine Empire. Now you think that was over? Now they're doing great. They're doing great. They survived all these different barbarian invaders. Well, they didn't survive the last big barbarian invader, and that would be the Turks. Now the Turks were people who, we've mentioned them before. They were in China. They had crossed the Eurasian steppe, and there were different tribes of Turks. But this particular tribe of Turks was called the Seljuk Turks because they're the Seljuk family, the dynasty of sultans, were their rulers. And the Seljuk Turks had recently converted to Islam, and they had a lot of fire in their belly. They were not like the Arabs. You know, the Arabs had gotten a little staid, a little quiet, not quite so enthusiastic. But these Seljuk Turks, they were really up for jihad, man. They wanted to wage jihad, and they were really happy. And there were a bunch of these Turkish warriors were great on horseback. They were great warriors and great fighters. So the Byzantine Empire really was under siege. So these Seljuk Turks are threatening, and now it turned out by the time you get to 1071 AD that the Byzantine army was not what it used to be. What had happened over the course of centuries is that the militia had kind of collapsed, and these former warriors in the militia, kind of like the National Guardsmen, so to speak, they had given up their land. Many of them had become tenant farmers, and by the time you get to the 11th century, the Byzantine army no longer had its own armies to fight for it. They basically, the militia had been weakened. Many of the farmers had lost their land or were now tenant farmers, and so the Byzantine Empire was forced to rely on mercenaries. Now, by 1071 AD, the mercenaries they were hiring were Vikings. They were hiring Norwegians and Swedes and Danes and Normans to do their fighting for them. And the thing about these Vikings, they didn't give a crap about the Byzantine Empire. All they cared about was, gold. Well, anyway, so the Byzantine Empire, his name was Michael Dukakis, presidential candidate. He was just a kid, but he was the emperor, and his generals went out to meet the Turks in eastern Turkey, and they had most of their army were Vikings, mercenaries. Well, these Vikings, they were pretty good warriors themselves, but they saw these Turkish guys coming out, and they said, "We're out of here. We're not, you can pay me all the gold you want. I'm not fighting them." And they left. So the Byzantine army was completely crushed, and the Seljuk Turks, they just kept on going. And eventually they gave their name to Turkey. So many Turks over the years settled in what was formerly the Byzantine Empire, what was formerly what we consider Anatolia, that eventually it would become known as Turkey by the time we get to the 20th century, 19th, 20th century. So the Turks came in and occupied, and the Battle of Manzikert was a turning point because what happened was that after Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantine Empire basically shrunk to be basically just Constantinople, parts of Greece, and parts of extreme western Anatolia, and that was it. It just was a shadow of itself after the Battle of Manzikert. So the Manzikert is one of the great turning points in world history because it led to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and allowed the Turks to become the dominant power, not only in Anatolia, but throughout the Near East, throughout the Middle East. The Turks were the great power and they would remain in that position all the way up until really the 19th and 20th centuries. The Turks Turkish powers remained dominant in the Middle East and in that part of the world, and the Near East.
Is this where the Turks basically started taking over as far as were these Turks Muslims?
They're Muslims, yes.
So this is where the Turkey, quote unquote, became inundated with all the
Turks.
Islam, right?
This is how Turkey became Turkey.
Right.
Now it got worse for them. In 1204, and we'll talk about this later, but when the Crusaders were supposed to go to the Holy Land. They got sidetracked, and the Crusaders, instead of waging war in the Holy Land, conquered Constantinople in 1204. And for a while, French knights controlled the former Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantine Empire was even able to survive that. They were able to kick out the Franks, kick out the Gauls, kick out the French, and recover. But finally, in 1453, once again, you had a new Turkish dynasty. These would be the Ottoman Turks, because the Ottoman family were the rulers of these Turks. The Ottoman Turks finally succeeded in taking Constantinople. So Constantinople finally fell to a Muslim army in 1453. And after that, it was no longer known as Constantinople. It became known as Istanbul. Now, Istanbul is actually a corruption of the Greek word, the city. That's what it is. Stipoli in Greek, in the Byzantine Empire, when they referred to Constantinople, the Greeks referred to it as Stipoli, which means the big city. Stipoli. And so when the Turks took it over, they just kept the name, and Istanbul is a corruption of the Greek word Stipoli. So for the Ottoman Empire, when they made it their capital, it just was known, it became known as Istanbul, which is the name it still retains to this day. So that, in a nutshell, is the history of the Byzantine Empire. All right, well, we're going to take a little break now, and now we're going to talk about this subject in detail, but while you're taking your break, in your groups, I want you to think about what would be, in what ways, from what you know so far, was the Byzantine Empire, in what ways did they draw from the legacy of ancient Rome? All right? So I want you to think about that and talk about how did they draw from, how did this empire, how did the story of these people, how did they draw from, how were they influenced by the legacy of ancient Rome? So I want you to think about that, and we'll for about 5 minutes or so, and we'll take a little break.
Dr. Boyd?
Yes?
One thing you were talking about Greek fire.
Now, what I want to talk about is kind of like the influence of Byzantine civilization and how it is shaped. You know, you think that a civilization that hundreds of centuries ago ceased to exist wouldn't have a big impact today, but you'd be surprised. Now, one of the things about this empire was that it was very much influenced by, especially the late Roman Empire. We talked about how they had emperors. Remember, under the Dominate, as created by Diocletian, remember the emperor was more than just a man. Now, even though the Byzantine emperors were Christian, they still tried to give this impression that the emperor was not just a man, that he was somehow chosen by God, anointed. He was, remember in the Old Testament, maybe you guys don't study the Old Testament, but in the Old Testament, you had to be anointed. You know, Saul was anointed by the prophet Samuel. David was anointed, and that meant that they were appointed by God to lead God's people. And that image was very much a part of the Byzantine Empire. They were Christians, so the emperor was not worshipped like a god. That would have been a sin. But the emperor was considered to be the anointed one. He was considered to be Christ-like. Remember that emperor who got whipped as he carried the cross around the city? They considered themselves to be the viceroys, the representative of Christ on earth. So they weren't Christ; they were Christ-like, and they were the anointed of God. Their person was sacred. And if you went to the presence of a Byzantine emperor, you had to get down on all fours and kiss his feet, and you had to you never turned your back on the emperor. So he was considered to be, his person was considered sacred and holy, and there were a lot of protocols and rituals surrounding the person of the emperor. Whenever the emperor they had a senate, for example. Whenever the emperor would go into the senate, all the elected officials, all the most, not elected, but all the important officials of the empire were in the senate. Whenever he went to the senate, he was hailed and adored by the senate like hundreds of times. They would yell his name hundreds and hundreds of times, like he was like a rock star. You know, he was an idol, so to speak.
That's what the inference was from the anointing, was that it was a blessing upon the person to sanctify them They anointed the brow, they anointed the right thumb, they anointed the foot.
Yeah, it was that kind of imagery was adopted by the Byzantine Empire. Now in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor was both head of church and head of state. So in the Byzantine Empire, historians have termed this Caesaro-papism. In the Byzantine Empire, the emperor was not just the military and political leader, the Caesar, but he was also the head of the church. He was the Pope and the Caesar all rolled into one, head of both church and state. And so officials in the church were appointed by the emperor. So bishops were appointed by the emperor. They were subject to the emperor's authority. They could be dismissed at his discretion, or he could put a new person in anytime he wanted. So he's the head of the church. Now, there were limits on what this authority of the emperor could do, because remember, the emperor might be holy and sacred, but he was still a man. And so there was still this idea that there was a higher law. So there were limits to what emperors could do. And you can see this in what happened in the what's called the iconoclasm controversy. Icons, here's an icon. Icons are images of the saints or images of Jesus or Mary that were revered. They were considered to be objects that you could. The idea was that by focusing in on an image, you could feel God's power. You could feel the Holy Spirit. So the reverence for icons had developed within the Byzantine Empire. Now it was especially strong in the monasteries. The monks, almost every monastery had certain icons that were revered by people for miles and miles. People would go to monasteries just to see an icon, because these icons were supposed to emit holy power. It was believed that these icons were powerful. Holy Spirit was present in them. So if you went to and kissed an icon, you would get some of that holy power in you. And monasteries were well known for having these icons. Well, during the 8th century, Leo the Isaurian and his successors, they came to believe that one reason why the empire was suffering and was experiencing all these setbacks and these invasions was because that icons were idols, and that it was idolatry, and that God was sending these invaders against the Byzantine Empire because God wanted to punish it and purge the land of these idols. So the emperors, they're called iconoclasts because they went to war against the icons. So these emperors in the 8th century, the Isaurian dynasty especially, they started ordering monasteries that had icons to shut them down. They ordered icons to be destroyed. They said the only image, the only object of veneration should be the cross and the cross alone. They even went into churches and destroyed all the paintings, and so that there would only be a cross. Only the cross would be allowed in a church. And they found evidence of ancient churches in Greece where during this 8th century mosaics and frescoes were purposely destroyed because these emperors believed this was idolatry. Well, the thing was that they could not defeat it. And the fact of what was the matter with it, see, in the Byzantine Empire, the monasteries were independent. They weren't subject to the local bishop's authority. So these monasteries and these monks, they resisted. They would not give up their icons. And some monks even faced death rather than give up their icons. And so they could not do it. And so eventually, by the end of the 8th century, the church decided, the emperors decided, we can't do this anymore. So it was the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 784 AD was when the church, the Byzantine church, decided that icons were okay. So the emperor might have been all powerful, he might have been head of church and state, but there were limits to what he could do. He could not crush the icons. And the result was that icons continue to this day to be a big part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And people still, if you go to Greece today, you can still visit monasteries where buses of pilgrims will come so they can go and kiss the icons. So I spent a year in Greece when I was in college, and we went to this famous monastery in northern Greece, and it had all these icons there, and hordes of Greek pilgrims. These little old ladies, they're called yayas. They're all grandmas. They all wear black because they're all widows. These yayas will go in buses because they believe that they kiss these icons, that they will bring health to their family, to their grandchildren. So these yayas, if you get in their way, man, they'll kick your ass, man. I mean, they said, look at the icons fast, because once the yayas come, you're not going to have a chance, because they will just be like, the icon, you know. I mean, they'll run. These little old ladies, you know, they're all like carrying canes, and they're running to kiss every icon, because if they kiss the icon, they're going to be a blessing to their family, you know. And this still goes on to this day. And that was in the. Hopefully it's still going on. That was in the 80s. I went from college. But anyway, so they couldn't crush the icons, and eventually if you can't beat them, join them. So icons are still a part of the Orthodox Church. Another thing about the Orthodox Church was that whenever they spread their religion, they brought their culture with them. For example, two monks named Cyril and Methodius, they were sent by the emperors to what is today Slovakia in Eastern Europe to try to convert the Slavs to Christianity. And they realized that these Slavs were not going to convert to Christianity unless they could read the Gospels. So what they did was to devise a new writing system, a new alphabet for Slavs. And for some reason it wasn't named after Methodius, it was named after Cyril. Poor Methodius. So it's called Cyrillic. It's called the Cyrillic alphabet. And every country that adopted the Eastern form of Christianity became Eastern Orthodox. Every Orthodox church adopted Cyrillic as its alphabet. So the Cyrillic language is still used in Russia and in Serbia and in Bulgaria to this day. It's the alphabet they use. And also, when these people converted to Christianity as a result of the efforts of the Byzantine Empire, not only did they adopt the religion of Christianity, they adopted the culture and the institutions as well. For example, in 864, the ruler of Bulgaria, Boris, converted to Christianity. And from that time onward, he took on the title of Caesar, which in the Slavic form is Tsar. So that became the term used to describe a Bulgarian ruler. And in the Bulgarian church, the emperor was the head of church and the head of the state. So the Bulgarians adopted the culture along with the religion of the Byzantine Empire. The same was true in Russia. In 987, Vladimir, he was a pagan at the time. He was the prince of Kiev. He embraced Christianity, became an ally of Boris the Bulgar slayer, married Boris's daughter, and he converted to the Greek Orthodox faith. And in Russia adopted the Cyrillic alphabet, and Russian art. Russia, you have icons. Russia, you have Russian churches follow many of the influences of Byzantine architecture and Byzantine art. So when the Russians adopted the Orthodox faith, the Christian faith, they adopted the culture of the Byzantine Empire as well. Now, another big thing that happened was that eventually the church in Constantinople and the Orthodox church there went its separate ways with the church in the West, led by the Pope in Rome. So it's called a schism. Now, this schism was not really so much based on doctrine or theology as much as it was based on secondary issues. For example, in 1054, the Pope in Rome claimed that he was the true successor of Peter, the true successor and the leader of the church, and that all Christians should recognize the authority of the Church of Rome. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople, patriarch is just like Pope and patriarch, will both come from the word for father, Papa Pope, and patriarch, father. And the Patriarch was the Patriarch of Constantinople was one of the leading church members. And the Patriarch of Constantinople said, no, look, Rome, every church is independent. Every church has its own tradition, its own bishop, and every church should have its own, they don't have to be subject to the Pope in Rome. So the Patriarch said, we're not going to listen to you. And now by this time there developed some differences between the churches, and some minor differences. For example, in the West, the monasteries were under the authority of the local bishop, whereas in the East they were not. They were independent. In the West, they had what's called the Filioque clause. In the Nicene Creed was was slightly different than the creed used in the Greek Orthodox Church. In the Greek Orthodox Church, there is no, in the Greek Orthodox Church, they don't say the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. They just say it comes from the Father. Whereas in the Western Church, they say it comes from the Father and the Son. So there was a difference there that had developed over time. There's some minor differences in the Eastern Orthodox Church. They focus primarily on Jesus Christ triumphant, resurrecting from the grave. In the Western Church, they focused on the suffering Christ on the cross, dying for the sins of the world. I mean, they both believed in the same thing. It was just an emphasis difference. So they're developed over the centuries. And of course, the big difference, one of the major differences, cultural differences, was in the Greek Orthodox Church. Greek was the language of the church. And they also allowed for local languages to be spoken. So in the Greek Orthodox Church, in Slavic lands, you could speak a Slavic language. But in the Roman Church, it was only Latin and Latin alone that could be spoken at a church service, in the liturgy.
Didn't they just here recently, not too many years ago, remove the Latin liturgy?
Yeah, Vatican II, I think, in 1961. It's only been in the 20th century that Latin was not been used as the language of the church service in the Roman Catholic Church. Mel Gibson has a Latin-speaking church that he built in Malibu for himself. Anyway, but anyway, so eventually what happened is the churches split. It's called the Great Schism. The Pope in Rome, he told, his name was, I'll tell you later. I'm having a senior moment here. But anyway, the Pope excommunicated the Bishop of Constantinople, kicked him out of the church, and the Bishop of Constantinople kicked the Roman Church out of the church, and so the churches went their separate ways. And they've been separated ever since. So the Orthodox Church in the East, and the Orthodox churches, sometimes called Greek Orthodox, they are separate and independent from the Roman Catholic Church in the West. And that's been the case ever since 1054. All right. Well, we ran out of time today, but we are going to finish up this topic, and we're going to talk about Islam and the Franks in the West. We're going to do that on Wednesday. Now, don't also remember, written assignment number 3 is coming up. That's due Wednesday night. You use the Dropbox. You can turn it in 11:59 p.m. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Now, just out of curiosity, while we're leaving, that is where the